I know, we can act like plants. Photosynthesis. Photosynthesis.
Want to go to the park?
If you want to know how a plant grows, it takes water, air and sunlight and makes cellulose. Every plant can do this fundamental process, and we can call this photosynthesis. Unlike me and you, plants need CO2, and they make oxygen that stops us turning blue. Every plant can do this fundamental process, and we can call this photosynthesis. It's a miracle how all the chlorophyll captures sunlight in the leaves of the plants and the trees. A plant of any size can do it if it tries, but we're not green, so we can't photosynthesize. Every plant can do this fundamental process, and we can call this photosynthesis. It's a miracle how all the chlorophyll captures sunlight in the leaves of the plants and the trees. Every plant can do this fundamental process, and we can call this photosynthesis. Every plant can do this fundamental process, and we can call this photosynthesis. Photosynthesis.
The Earth needs more trees. We can plant new ones, and we can protect the trees we already have. For example,
it takes 17 tall trees to make 1 ton of paper.
Put it this way. When you recycle 1 ton of paper,
You make sure 17 trees remain standing.
so recycle and help save our forests.
The power is yours.
So far, we've seen discoveries that revealed the biology of life on the microscopic level. Our next great discoveries opened our eyes to the biology of the macro, those systems on which all life on the planet depends. The year is 1771. Chemist Joseph Priestley conducts a series of experiments to see what happens when he heats various substances in closed jars and collects any gases coming off. In one of the experiments, he put a lit candle under the jar, but the flame quickly burned out. In Priestley's words, the air inside was injured. Curious what effect this injured air might have on a living thing, he placed a mint leaf inside the jar and left it there for 10 days. When Priestley checked back, incredibly, the leaf was still green. Somehow the air inside the jar was fresh again. Priestley speculated that the mint leaf must be responsible for this transformation. But how? This question remained unanswered until a Dutch scientist named Jan Ingenhousz decided to duplicate Priestley's experiments. Using plants, Ingenhousz witnessed the same beguiling phenomenon. After conducting a series of more tests, Ingenhousz began to realize what was happening. The ability of a plant to transform the air inside the jar only worked if the plant was exposed to sunlight. This was the breakthrough. Together, Priestley and Ingenhousz had discovered photosynthesis, the biochemical process by which plants trap the energy of sunlight and convert it into chemical energy. Photosynthesis removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and replenishes it with the gas on which our survival depends, oxygen. The same gas that Joseph Priestley would discover 3 years later in 1774.
photosynthesis. I love photosynthesis because it gives me two things that I need. I need to breathe, so it gives me oxygen, and I need to eat, and so it's going to give me food. And so I love photosynthesis. You might think it's only found in these things, plants, but it's also found in bacteria, it's found in algae, and so it's found in protists, it's found everywhere. And so photosynthesis has been around a long time. It's super important that you understand how it works. And so let's start with the site in eukaryotic cells of photosynthesis, and that's the chloroplast. So this is a number of cells, and you can see how many chloroplasts we could have in a typical cell. So there's a whole bunch of them. There are a few terms that you should be familiar with and where they are. First one is a thylakoid membrane. Thylakoid membrane is going to be organized like this. And basically, that's where the light reaction is going to take place. If you got a stack of thylakoids like this together, we call that a grana. The other big thing to understand photosynthesis is that this is filled with a liquid, and that liquid is called the stroma. That's going to be the site of the Calvin cycle. So let's start with an equation, because this is simply a chemical reaction. It's a chemical reaction with a number of steps. But what are the reactants? Water and carbon dioxide. And so how does a plant grow? It's basically taking water in from its roots, and it's taking carbon dioxide in through its leaves, through its stomata. The other thing it needs is light. And so it's just taking these simple ingredients, and then it's weaving those together into glucose, this monster molecule here, and then oxygen. And so this is the food that I get, and this is the oxygen that I breathe. Now, are plants just nice? No, they're making this sugar for themselves, so they can break it down using cellular respiration. And in fact, if I put this arrow in the other direction, that becomes cellular respiration. So they're making food for themselves, and they're also going to make some of the structures. So like the cellulose in the cell walls of a plant is made from that. What are the reactants again? Water, light, and carbon dioxide. What are going to be the products that come out of this? It's going to be oxygen and glucose. So let's watch what happens. In the light-dependent reaction, water and light go into the thylakoid membrane, and they produce two things. They produce oxygen. Oxygen is simply a waste product. And then they're going to produce these chemicals, NADPH and ATP. So they have energy now. Let's watch what happens to them. Well, the energy is going to transfer to the Calvin cycle, where carbon dioxide comes in and then glucose goes out. And so this is the big picture of photosynthesis. As that electron moves through the electron transport chain, and again, it's powered by the introduction of light here and light here, that electron is going to be moving all the way down here, and every time it goes through one of these proteins, it's pumping protons to the inside. So it's pumping protons to the inside. Now, protons have a positive charge. So basically what's happening is that you're building up a positive charge on the inside. So there's a positive charge in here. Now we have all these positive charges on the inside. Where do they go? Well, there's only one hole that they can go through, and that is to go through this protein here. As those protons move out, they're moving through a protein called ATP synthase, and it works almost like a little rotor. And every time a proton goes through, we make another ATP. So what have we made in the light-dependent reaction? We've made NADPH and we've made ATP. And what's nice about that is they're now just sitting right here in the stroma, and so they're able to go on to the Calvin cycle, which is going to be the next step in this process. And so who's providing the energy? Light. Who's providing the electrons? Water. And then a base or a waste product of that is simply going to be oxygen. Okay, let's go to the Calvin cycle then. So what's happening in the Calvin cycle? You can see here's those reactants. So we've got our ATP here, and NADPH. What are they providing? Simply energy. We also have this molecule here. It's called RUBP. Basically, it's a 5-carbon molecule. And then we have carbon dioxide coming in. So it moves through the stomata of the leaf, and it's going to diffuse its way in. Carbon dioxide is a 1-carbon molecule. So basically there's an enzyme here called Rubisco, and it's going to attach this 1-carbon molecule to a 5-carbon molecule. It immediately breaks into 2 3-carbon molecules, and then it gets energy from ATP and NADPH. And when we're done, it's creating this chemical down here called G3P. What does G3P become? Well, it can be assembled quickly into glucose or sucrose or maltose or whatever they need to do. That's going to be produced right in here by the G3P. So that's the big picture. If we don't have ATP, if we don't have NADPH, then this process is going to shut down. What's the other thing that could shut it down if we don't have carbon dioxide? Okay, so that's basically photosynthesis. And again, it's been working for billions of years.
Carbon is one of the most abundant elements in the universe, and here on Earth it's always on the move, just like water jumping from one reservoir to the next. And that's a good thing, because A, all living things require carbon for their structure and to fuel their bodies, and B, it's a big component in a bunch of non-living things as well. It's in rocks, in the ocean, trapped in ice, plus it's in the atmosphere, where it helps regulate the temperature. Without carbon dioxide, Earth would basically be a frozen wasteland, so lucky for us, there's a whole pants load of carbon out there, because we need it. Let's start out with the carbon in living things. If you were to take all of the water out of your body, carbon would constitute about half of what remained in the little pile of dust that used to be you. And the first biological carbon reservoir is plants. They absorb a bunch of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere because they need it to photosynthesize. But CO2 is also one of the byproducts of respiration, the process by which they use that energy. So plants take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere during photosynthesis and then release CO2 back out into the atmosphere during their respiration process to make ATP for all their cellular functions. And right now, you're like, wait, no, isn't the deal that plants get to take in the carbon dioxide and animals get to breathe it out? Well, yes and no. It's just that plants take in more CO2 from the atmosphere than they give off through respiration. The rest is like their profit. It's what becomes the body of the plant. That's right, that big old massive tree, all of that mass came from gas. Pretty cool. So carbon absorbed by plants has three possible fates. It can be respired back into the atmosphere, it can be eaten by an animal, or it can be present when the plant dies. And if a tree falls in the right kind of forest and it's not allowed to decompose normally because a bunch of other plants all fell right on top of it and they die and get buried and squished together and form rocks like coal. We call these carbon-rich geological deposits fossil fuels. Lately, one of humanity's very favorite pastimes is digging up all of this old carbon in the form of coal and oil and natural gas and burning it to fuel our pretty much everything's. But I'll get to that later. Another extremely important carbon reservoir is the ocean. Now, carbon dioxide dissolves really easily in water, and once it's in there, a lot of it's used by phytoplankton, tiny plant-like organisms that form the base of the marine food chain. They use carbon in photosynthesis, and they also use it to make calcium carbonate shells. And when these guys die, their shells settle to the bottom of the ocean, pile up, become compressed, and over time, make rocks like limestone. Now, limestone obviously doesn't burn super well, so it's not considered a fossil fuel, but as limestone deposits are eroded by water, the calcium carbonate is broken down to eventually form, among other things, carbon dioxide and carbonic acid. We make lime and cement by heating limestone, which produces a pretty good amount of carbon dioxide. And when we do burn fossil fuels such as coal and petroleum products and natural gas, it also releases carbon in the form of carbon dioxide that's been stored for hundreds of millions of years in the geosphere, which is just a fancy sciencey word for Earth rocks. This process is what started the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels rising like crazy in the past couple hundred years, and the excess of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere causes global climate change because CO2 in the atmosphere prevents some of the sun's energy from re-radiating back out into space. So yeah, our planet is getting warmer because we've been burning through this massive reservoir of carbon that we had locked underground. This is causing all kinds of problems that we can see already, and it's very likely going to keep causing bigger and bigger problems with time. And the situation could be helped a lot if we would just stop unlocking all of that carbon and spitting it in the atmosphere, but
it's so powerful it can turn off the sun, but then it gets too cold, so it makes another sun. Double sun power!
The ingredients are simple: sunshine, carbon dioxide, and water. For at least 2 billion years, that recipe has worked for plants. Through the process of photosynthesis, leaves convert the sun's rays into their own energy source. What if we could develop a technology that mimics the chemistry of a leaf and produces clean, abundant fuels directly from sunlight? At JCAP, the Joint Center for Artificial Photosynthesis, scientists aren't just dreaming of this technology, they're building it. The amount of energy from the sun that reaches the Earth in 1 hour could power all human energy needs for an entire year. JCAP's goal to create chemical fuels directly from the sun would produce a solar fuel that could power airplanes, cargo ships, and large trucks not suitable as electric vehicles, and utilize our existing storage tanks and pipelines. Unlike fossil fuels, solar fuels won't add any new carbon to the atmosphere. In taking inspiration from a leaf and harnessing the power of sunlight in a new way, we'll add a vital option to our clean energy mix that could create a pollution-free fuel for global transportation. In learning from nature, we'll help to preserve it.
Hello, this is Hank Green, and welcome to SciShow. You might have noticed that I talk a lot about how great plants are, and why shouldn't I? They're autotrophs. They can harness the raw, untamed power of the sun and use it to make food for themselves. Pretty impressive. So why can't animals do it? Well, oddly enough, some of them do. And in just the past few years, researchers have been discovering animals that seem to be able to harvest sunlight for energy. Take, for instance, the eastern emerald alysia, a sea slug that looks like a big floating leaf. It lives along the east coast of the United States, where it just hangs out eating a specific kind of yellow-green algae. It's been known for a long time that this slug had a special relationship with the algae, but until recently, nobody knew that the slug was actually using the algae's genes for photosynthesis. See, the slug eats the algae to absorb its chloroplasts, the organelles in the cells that actually do the photosynthesizing. But in order to turn the sunlight into chemical energy, the chloroplasts need a whole set of specialized proteins to help. So the slug has lifted genes from the algae that allow it to make these proteins itself. Nobody's sure exactly how this happened, but we do know that these slugs pass those algal genes on to their little baby slugs, which only need to eat about 2 weeks of the year. The rest of the time, they're just soaking in the rays. Another photosynthesizing animal is the pea aphid, which, depending on environmental conditions at birth, can be either white, orange, or green. Now, aphids are notoriously weird. Some of them can be born pregnant. Some males are born with no mouths and die of starvation right after mating. So maybe it's not a huge surprise that pea aphids have been found to manufacture their own carotenoids, colorful compounds that plants, fungi, and some algae use to help with photosynthesis. Carotenoids help plants absorb more light and protect their chlorophyll molecules, which make photosynthesis possible. Animals need carotenoids too. Beta-carotene, a precursor of vitamin A, is one you've probably heard of, but we can only obtain them by eating plants that make them. But since pea aphids have somehow acquired the genes to make their own carotenoids, scientists have found that some aphids, depending on their color, can use sunlight to make adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, the same energy-storing molecule that plants create through photosynthesis and that we make by metabolizing food. Researchers have found that aphids with green carotenoids make a whole lot more ATP than white aphids do, while orange aphids make more ATP when exposed to sunlight than when kept in the dark. Weirder and weirder, right? Well, hang on to your hats, because the spotted salamander, common to the eastern United States and Canada, is the first and so far only known photosynthetic vertebrate. In 2010, scientists discovered that these salamanders have chlorophyll-containing algae in their cells all over their bodies, and the cells with algae in them actually seem to help power other nearby cells. Again, no one's sure how this relationship came about, but the algae has been found to first appear in the salamander's fertilized eggs, possibly when the embryos are just big enough to feed the algae with their waste, creating a kind of algal bloom inside the eggs. The algae then enter the embryo's body, probably when the nervous system first forms, and they spend the rest of their lives together. All of this is totally surprising because vertebrates' immune systems generally destroy foreign stuff that tries to live inside their cells, but this salamander and the algae Seemed to be a match made in heaven. So it's good to know that there is indeed an exception to every rule. Now that we know about at least 3 good examples of photosynthesizing animals and we can start to wrap our minds around how exactly that works, who knows? Humans could be next.